Hey everybody, it's Rudy Basso, the co-owner of Don't Split the Podcast Network. I would like to encourage you, lovely listener, to head on over to our website and give a listen to my show that I host with my brother called Game O'Clock. It is a video game retrospective, introspective, other spectives, all about the kind of games that we love. And to be honest, we love just about every game out there. Game O'Clock released every Thursday. It's fun, it's short, and hey, you'll probably learn something about video games.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking with podcasters and superhero/RPG aficionados Rich Howard and Caleb Gillombardo. As hosts of Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast, and lovers and designers of tabletop games, I thought there were no better folks to dish on superhero RPGs. There's so many systems out there. Which is best for your game? Let's jump right into the good stuff. Here's my chat with them. Okay, everybody, now I am here with Caleb and Rich, two people who I consider experts not just on superheroes, but also on tabletop role-playing games. Guys, welcome so much to Tabletop Babble. It is exciting to have you here. How are you doing?
Thanks so much, James, for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is so great to be here. Thanks a lot.
And let's just, for the listeners out there, Caleb, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself so that they can get to know your voice?
Well, I'm just this guy that sits here talking into a microphone, hoping there's someone else on the other side in the expanse of the internet. You may know me from the RPG Academy. That is the podcast where I am the co-host. And with Michael over there, we talk about all things gaming. We tend to focus on how to excel as a new GM, getting into the series, honing your craft, and developing your skills. We also pioneered the RPG Academy Network, where we have a variety of podcasts and websites that have partnered with us, both to spread the word and share our mission that if you are having fun at the gaming table, you are doing it right. We have a lot of actual plays. We have a lot of websites and blogs and different things like that, just generally talking about the hobby that we all love so much. And then something crazy possessed me last year. I blame Rich completely. And I started Whelmed, the Young Justice Files with Rich. And we are here every week, twice a week now, talking about the DC animated cartoon, The Young Justice. Or just Young Justice. We are the Young Justice Files. That's the Young Justice. I don't know why I said the twice. I've been recording all day. I'm kind of loopy.
Rich, you are the something crazy aforementioned in Caleb's story. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and your own experience, not just with Whelmed, but also with tabletop RPGs?
Sure. Some people may have known my articles from tribality.com. I have in the past had 2 columns over there, including From the Depths, where I talk a lot about aquatic gaming and settings in a variety of both fantasy and science fiction, and a little bit in superheroes as well. And I seem to be a serial podcast guest on the Tome Show, your previous podcast, as well as Dungeon Master's Block. I've been on the RPG Academy and a few other things. I'm also a huge superhero and comic geek and a big fan of Young Justice as well. So, that came up last year that there was a whole campaign to try and get a 3rd season of Young Justice. It had been canceled prematurely. So there's been a couple of year campaign to get Netflix or someone else, but theoretically Netflix, to pick up the show for a 3rd season. And so I was promoting that idea on social media. People would ask me questions about it. I would answer questions and drop hints and talk about spoilers and, give them key links to things that happen in the comics and the history of the characters. And then somebody said, dude, you should start a podcast. So, and then about, I think 0.6 seconds later, Caleb jumped on me and said, please let me help you do this. I'm like, I don't know how to do it. Yes, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I guest on podcasts, but I don't edit yet anyway. I have a lot to say, but I need some help. And Caleb heroically jumped in with his Superboy t-shirt on and has helped make Whelmed what it is today. And we don't just talk about the show. We actually use it as a springboard to talk about storytelling, gaming, what you can learn from the show as examples of excellent storytelling for ensemble casts. We've had guests such as Steve Kenson, who we'll probably bring up today because he's the writer of Mutants and Masterminds. Mm-hmm. We've had Quinn Wilson talking about linguistics and psychology and storytelling and how you can use those to improve character development. And so we do far more than just talk about the show. We have these discussion sessions where we talk about how you yourself can be a better creator.
And it is an amazing podcast. Everybody should check out Whelmed, The Young Justice Files, and you should also check out Young Justice. It is a great show. We were just chatting before we recorded. You know, it reminds me of the Batman Timverse that we all grew up with, where Mark Hamill was the Joker, and we had some great voice acting and some awesome storytelling, and this is of that caliber. Really, really good stuff. And then you get all of these amazing insights. It's actually really just a well-produced podcast that, like you said, uses the show as a springboard to talk about tons of other stuff. Or you could just listen to the show too, and ignore the springboard and just dive right in. That's also really great. So it's great to have you guys here. One thing I want to talk about is superhero role-playing games, and I could not think of two more qualified people than yourself to come on and do that, right? Like, you guys are the perfect intersection of these two things, and I think there's a lot of people out there, right? Both hobbies, comic books and superheroes and that world, and tabletop role-playing games attract nerds or geeks or whatever, and, you know, it's becoming apparent that everybody's really a nerd, everybody's a geek, and that's a great thing. So I thought, let's get these two guys together, and let's talk a little bit about it, because a lot of people out there play D&D or Pathfinder, but it's hard to know, like, what system do I want to jump into, right? Like, just a sampling, and I'm sure we won't even talk about everybody's favorite system today because there are so many, right? Mutants and Masterminds, you guys called out. Champions, Masks, Rotted Capes, Capes Cows, and Villains Foul. And those are just unlicensed superhero games, you know, like, not to mention the Marvel and DC iterations over the years. And then, like, you could use GURPS or Fate or Savage Worlds or the Cypher system to create a role-playing game that focuses on superheroes. So I think diving right in, if we wanted to make set in our modern world, you know, Justice League or Avengers style superheroes, what system do you guys recommend people check out, and why, if they've never played a superhero RPG before, but they are familiar with, let's say, a fantasy variety like a D&D or Pathfinder?
Well, I think the first question you have to ask is, what kind of story do you want to tell? I was around and alive when D&D was created and learned how to play in 77, 78. And so for me, being a big comic geek, as soon as I found out that there were other non-fantasy role-playing games where I could play a superhero, man, I was all over that like crazy. But if you look at something like Champions that came out back in 1983, or like even the Superhero 2044 game, which is reputed to basically be the first superhero role-playing game from back in like 77, 78, these games were very mechanics heavy, like a lot of early role-playing games were, or Superworld, who used the kind of the Chaosium system. They were all about the mechanics of how to get your superpowers represented. But I talk about on the show a lot, the best superhero stories actually aren't really about the superpowers. The great thing about Young Justice, for example, just to pull a random example out of the air, the stories that are the best in there aren't about, say, you know, Zatanna and her father Zatara, their magical powers. It's about how Zatara makes sacrifices in this one episode for her that make you cry your freaking eyes out, you know? So what stories do you want to tell? Do you want to tell an action adventure story, or do you want to take a dark Champions kind of street level, you know, dirty hero game? Do you want to do an Avengers style Guardians of the Galaxy space spanning game? Do you want to get into the personalities of the characters more than you do? Is the superpowers just dressing to tell really deep stories? Because what you choose is the difference between something really heavy crunch like a Champions and something really storytelling focused like Masks. Mm-hmm. So what story do you want to tell is going to be what system you're going to end up choosing. What do you think, Caleb?
I don't even know how to start answering this question. I'll do it the most directly. James, you said, what's your go-to system? My go-to system is Wushu. Period. End of story.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because I'm guessing that is one a lot of people have not heard of out there.
But can I give a shout out real quick, Caleb? The RPG Academy has a hilarious and awesome actual play called the Wushuper Friends, which was a pretty great series, which I think Caleb was probably going to make a nod to, but I have to tell you should go listen to it. It's pretty great.
So Wushu is for lack of a better term, rules light tabletop gaming system. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot nowadays, doesn't have a super strong definition. But essentially, there's not a lot of mechanics behind it. You have a few very generalized skills available to you, and they are almost defined more like aspects. If you're familiar with Fate, they are phrases that describe who your character is and what they do. And when you're making checks in the game, instead of rolling for success, like you would in kind of a binary D&D success fail, or in Fate, you're rolling for a degree of success. In Wushu, instead, you are rolling for how much your success completes the scene. Anything you say happens. Period. Anything you define and describe happens. There's no, okay, I roll to see if I attack. No, you say, all right, I charge into battle. There's 15 goons around me. I jump up in the air. I slam down with my gravity power. I do a superhero landing. They all get blown backwards into the building. Then I see in the distance the main boss in his power armor. He's stomping towards me, shouting phrases in some weird language I can't understand.
He's monologuing.
He's monologuing at me. He unloads his laser turret cannon robot cat, and we start fighting. All of that literally happens in the game. There is no roll to see if it happens. The GM, or the person in charge of the game, sets a scene maximum for the number of successes needed to accomplish the scene. So we might say, going into this combat, we need 20 successes to move forward. So when I describe all those shenanigans, that generates dice, and then I roll those dice to see which ones succeed and fail. And then the number of successes I get counts towards that limit of 20, for example, to complete the scene. If I only get 5 successes, all of that stuff happens, but the scene keeps going. So it is a way to keep the narrative flow exciting and interesting. The game tends to get really goofy and really silly really fast. However, I have been experimenting with Wushu as a rule system, and I believe it is a perfect system to do anything with. If we want to play something dark and noir, if we want to play horror, if we want to play something gritty and real, it's possible to do any of that. But for the most part, when we think superheroes, we want to do something big and heroic and action-oriented. And a lot of times when we're grabbing those really crunchy, heavy systems, it's so easy to get lost in the mechanics that you can't have fun with the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that was part of what I was meaning to say earlier too, is like back in the day you had Champions, which was great, but nobody understood that it was as much a miniatures game as it was anything else. Even though we didn't really use miniatures, but because the mindset was there, there were no concept of having a game system that encouraged or involved the role playing aspect. Right, the role playing was created by your own mind, but there wasn't something like like fate with aspects or failing forward, from Dungeon World, Apocalypse World games. Your character isn't defined by, I fly around on fire and throw fireballs, that's who I am. Your character is literally defined as, what role do you play in the story? Right? I am a protege. My class, quote unquote, is protege. It doesn't matter what your powers are. It's the concept of the story is you are Robin to a Batman. Wow. Right? That's the core definition of who you are. So again, when you're talking about these superheroes, I agree with Caleb 100%. It's what kind of story do you want to tell? And you can use a lot of systems to represent those things. It just depends on where you want your mechanics to focus.
Sure. I think some are obvious, right? The one you just mentioned, I think, makes sense. Rotted Capes is one from Paradigm Concepts. It's basically the Marvel Zombie series. All of the A-list superheroes in the world have become zombies, but they're thinking zombies who have retained their power and they're eating the world. And then it's up to the sidekicks and also now the supervillains to save the world from these crazy zombies, right?
I hadn't heard of that one. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great idea because it's like Robin teams up with, somebody who wants to take over the world because there won't be any world to take over if these evil, super powerful zombies succeed, right? So I think some of them, it's very obvious, but when you're looking at something like, let's say you're looking at Masks and you're looking at Mutants and Masterminds, how do you know which game is best for what you want to play if you're not familiar with the system? Is there anything that can sort of save you from reading all of those pages and pages of rulebook? Like, what's the quick way to sort of determine, okay, I'm at Gen Con, I want to pick out a superhero game for me, like, which one do I play?
I think the question can be turned back on, are you talking about brand new players to any role-playing game, or are you talking about, like this, because the same question could be asked about, like, hey, I want to play a science fiction game.
Sure, it is a broader question, definitely. I think let's presume that the players have experience with a tabletop role-playing game, but maybe not a superhero one.
Right, and so if somebody came to me and asked me that, and I knew that they had some experience, I would say, okay, do you play, and they say, all right, I play fantasy role-playing games. I'm like, okay, do you play Pathfinder, or do you play Dungeon World? Mm-hmm. And then if they said, oh, I play Pathfinder, I love that. I'm like, all right, great, why don't you check out Champions? It's pretty crunchy, but it's a solid system. There's lots of detail. There's a lot of math. There's a lot of these things that a lot of people who play Pathfinder like to have those options. But if you hate Pathfinder and you love Dungeon World, then you're probably going to want to be doing something more like Masks. Mm-hmm. Or maybe Wushu, or a Fate-based game. If you're already playing Numenera, there's zero reason why you shouldn't just fold that into, a super cipher game of some sort. I don't know how much support Monte Cook Games has for that yet, but I do know that there's some stuff that they've been kind of playing with, and I think there's Cypher, like the Cypher core book that's not Numenera or The Strange. I think that has some ideas for running superhero stuff in it as well. Again, I think I would need to know, if you're brand new to role-playing, that's always a tough question. Like, how do you introduce someone to it? Like, if you have a younger player who's really into superheroes, man, let's do this. I want to run a superhero game for you. I probably wouldn't drop them into Champions the way that I was when I was 13.
Sure.
I still multiply and divide fractions in my head the way I learned how to do it in Champions, but I think there are more interesting ways and more quicker, easier, good systems like Wushu, like he's talking about, that you can adapt to tell the kind of story that someone wants to tell.
Caleb, what do you think? How do you get a quick read on what you want to use for the story you want to tell?
Honestly, the first thing I look at is the character sheet. If there's a book that I'm not familiar with, the first thing I do is flip to the back, because it's usually a pull-out page in the back that you can make copies of. I try to find the character sheet and try to compare that to what I know about other systems.
Yeah.
I look for what might be stats or attribute scores. I look for how skills are explained and used, because that gives me a context. I know Dungeons and Dragons through its various iterations. I know Exalted. I know Cypher System. I know Fate. I know GURPS. I have in my head this foundation of how those games work in the terms of how the character sheet is laid out in front of me. So if I pick up a book and I have no idea what it is, I try to find that as a quick connection. Another thing I do is look at the table of contents and try to find just the real quick section of building a character and jumping right into it. Am I rolling stats? Do I have a point buy system? Is this some sort of skill pool where I invest ranks in different things? That helps me figure out what the game is trying to do. A D20 level-based system is going to structure its characters in a very orderly, organized way. You're going to develop your powers slowly and methodically and in a balanced fashion. That's going to let me tell a very different superhero story than something like GURPS or Fate, where I can just buy whatever powers or abilities I want and skew what I'm really good at to where I want it to be. So looking at how characters are built, looking at the character sheet, that's a really fast way to get a read on what the system wants to let me do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great tip for any game, right? Like if you go and look at the character sheet, that will tell you a lot about a game if you're already familiar with role-playing games, right? You can look at it and be like, okay, I'm getting an idea of how this works. And then certainly going through the character creation section, flipping through that, gives you another good idea. You know, I love Mutants and Masterminds because I love that you can create pretty much any hero you want using their system. But you are going to take forever to do it. You know, it's going to take you a long time when you're sitting there building that character, thinking about what you want, and then being like, how do I get this? Is this I guess I could use Blast, and then I'll buy some into the extras here. Like, it takes forever to wrap your mind around building a character in that game, which is not for everybody, right? That's not what everybody wants to do. Some people just want to play a game. They want to sit down and be able to do that. Let's talk a little bit about officially licensed games, specifically Marvel and DC hero games. There have been plenty through the ages, some great, some not so great. Do you guys recommend licensed games? You know, Rich, I know like you love the Star Wars Fantasy Flight system. I think it's great. I think it's a great way to play Star Wars games. But when it comes to superheroes, what do you guys think? Do you think like you personally, would you rather tell your own story or play in one of these universes?
Again, for me, I think it depends on who I'm playing with. So first of all, like the Marvel superheroes game, the old face rip is the terrible acronym for that game. It wasn't my favorite back in the day, but there's a lot of nostalgia wrapped around it now. It was a pretty cinematic game. I have to say the DC Mayfair superhero game was kind of genius. It took that complicated thing you're talking about with mutants and masterminds and champions and GURPS, where you can build whatever you want, but the downside is you can build whatever you want. And you have to figure out how to build the thing you want, right? It took that point buy system, but somehow removed the 3 or 4 hour champions combat system and made it more cinematic and comic booky. It's a really good system. If you can track that down somewhere, I don't know if they have PDFs around or whatnot, it's pretty good. But if I had a kid, a kid or a friend who's a big DC Comics fan or something and just really liked that kind of 70s, 80s, 90s era superhero kind of stories, then I would by all means use like a DC Heroes game. There's no license like Young Justice or Batman the Animated Series style game, not officially anyway that I'm aware of, but for that kind of the animated universe where it's a nice balance of deep storyline with superhero action, I would use something like Masks from Magpie Games. Because you can represent whatever you want, but you don't have to build out whatever you want. It's about the story, more focused on the story than it is about, okay, so I have 40 points in Energy Blast, which is 8d6, but I want it to be an area of effect and a cone, but then I want it to not work underwater, so that's a half advantage with a quarter disadvantage. I mean, you don't need to do any of that stuff. It's just what story do you want to tell with your character?
So I see what you're saying. Again, it all comes down to what story do you want to tell. And when you think about it, right, superhero stories, it's no longer a single genre superhero. Many would argue that it never really was.
It never was. Yeah, it never ever was.
But I think even in the public's mind now, the public at large, when you look at all of the different Marvel movies, right? It's like these are all superhero movies. They all belong in the same universe, but each one is also a different genre within itself, right? And
Absolutely.
They've made it very clear they're trying to do that. Like Captain America, the Winter Soldier, is very different from Guardians of the Galaxy tonally,
Yep, absolutely.
And Rich would say one is better than the other.
Don't start me on that. Anyway, so I agree with you, and that was the thing back in the day. The idea that a role playing game could allow you to do anything you wanted was mind blowing concept. But went before Champions came out, because a superhero game was almost impossible to do, because of the fact that you basically have every genre mashed together into one game. You've got magical hammer wielding gods with powered armor and super agents and whatever, right? The concept of that kind of mechanic is so everybody gets it now, but back then it was just crazy. So telling a story that's wrapped around with all of these things was even more complicated, right? I ran a 2-year Champions game called Champions 2030 that took place in the year 2030. This was in 1990. So it was 40 years in the future. And we had 2 games running. We had like a 150-point Champions game that was kind of like this street level, heroic level game, and then another kind of unlimited point system, aliens invading the world, Avengers game going on as well. There was kind of a mix of near future and science fiction and all that kind of stuff. You can do whatever you want, but again, the downside of that is you can do whatever you want. So you got to figure out what you want and then try and find that through line, I think, which is actually harder to do for a superhero game than it really is for a fantasy or even a science fiction game, I think. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah, the paralysis of choice is very real in any role-playing game, especially when we're talking about mechanics that do not have any sort of limitation. So sometimes that's why a more strict level-based D20 type game can actually help, because it guides you in the choices that you want to make. So instead of sitting there with something like GURPS or Champions or whatever, where here's all your points. Hey, here's all your powers. Go crazy. The levels can tell you and guide you and help you figure out what you want to do. Now, that's also a downside to that type of system, because too much restriction means you can't always do what you want to do, and that can get you frustrated while you're trying to build a character. I think one of the most difficult things to do with a more typical level-based game is to build an existing character. I can't sit down in a D20 version of a superhero game and build Wolverine.
Right.
It's really, really hard. But I can pick up Marvel Heroics and play Wolverine.
Right.
I can grab something like Fate and kind of get to a good version of the character I am picturing in my head. Or I can grab Wushu and just say, I'm Wolverine. Done. In 2 seconds. So we keep saying this over and over and over, but it really does depend on what you want to do and what type of game you want to play. If you just want to say, I want to play Wolverine, I want to be the Avengers, I want to be Captain America, I want to be Superman, find a game that gives you that freedom. Either something that lets you build with all the crunchy bits exactly how you understand that character's power sets, or find a very free-form, rules-light system that just lets you write down sentences that say, I'm Superman, I can fly. and go.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and the internet too is great for that, right? Like, why, if you want to create Captain America in Mutants and Masterminds, I would just type Captain America and Mutants and Masterminds into the internet and let the internet show me what it has already created, right? So I think that you also have those resources now at your fingertips that maybe things we didn't have when we were, kids. So maybe you did, Caleb, because you're a young buck.
That's true. That's true. I don't understand this context you guys have of reading books and getting them from the bookstore.
That's right. He doesn't know when he clicks on the icon for saving something in Microsoft Word, he doesn't even know what he's clicking on.
Right, exactly.
Oh, wait a minute. That might be fighting words, James. I have very fond memories of floppy disks.
I'm sorry. What size floppy disk do you have a fond memory of would be my...
Was the floppy disk smaller than your head? Because then I don't know if that's really a floppy disk.
I grew up with the 7/8.
Okay. All right, that's fair.
All right. Yeah. That's
fair.
That's floppy. If it's actually floppy, that's good.
It was super floppy. I had to put it in a sleeve to put it away so it wouldn't bend and break.
Hey everybody, we are going to take a quick break and talk all about Audible. For listeners of Tabletop Babble, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day free trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Audible has tons of awesome books. They've got R.A. Salvatore's lineup. They've got J.R.R. Tolkien. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/DSPN. Again, that's audibletrial.com/DSPN for your free audiobook. All right, let's get back to that awesome interview. So let me ask you guys a question then. Obviously, there are all these very obvious superhero systems. When I was talking on social media about how we were going to do this episode about superheroes, one game that came up more than a few times was 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, which gave me this idea, and I think, it was a complaint for some, and it was advantage of other, that your characters are like superheroes in that game, because they were more powerful than previous editions of Dungeons and Dragons characters, even sort of from the start, from level 1 moving forward. So let me ask you guys a question. Are there systems that might be good for playing a superhero game that don't have somebody in a cape and tights on the cover? For instance, 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And if so, what comes to mind?
Well, Caleb already mentioned Wushu. Do you have anything else, Caleb? Because I got a couple as well.
I definitely agree with 4th edition being an amazing superhero game. Gamma World was a great alternate version.
Yeah.
They rebooted it into 4th edition rules. It was super post-apocalyptic, super funny and crazy, but it was very superhero-y.
Definitely. That's a good one.
I would throw a mention out of Exalted 3rd edition. Exalted is very much framed in Eastern fantasy, kind of that anime vibe. But if we look at a lot of anime, consider like Dragon Ball Z. Those are a bunch of superheroes running around punching each other.
Exactly. That's a good point. Yeah.
And Exalted lets you do that. Exalted as a system also goes crazy into social combat, social mechanics. There is so much support in those crazily crunchy, deep rules about just having interpersonal connections and relationships. Mm-hmm. But it also flips the coin over and lets you light up in a glowing golden beam that you can see for miles and take out 50 people. Super huge superhero game, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really, really good call. I mean, if you want some examples of that, you could hear the brilliant Quinn Wilson runs an Exalted one-shot on the podcast One Shot, and then he also has his own podcast, Swallows of the South, so you can get some examples of that. And it's crazy town, what they do in that game. It's pretty amazing. I think that's a really, really good example.
I also want to mention Shadowrun real fast. Shadowrun is one of my favorite games ever, if not my absolute favorite game. And even though Shadowrun is a much darker view of society and what your characters can do, there's definitely a level of being at that level of superpowers versus the random people around you. And Shadowrun is super crunchy, super heavy. You're rolling 30 dice at a time. But that makes you feel kind of like a superhero. We have to incorporate the mechanics and the reality of what we're doing at the table while we are playing pretend.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah.
If I'm saying, all right, I'm Superman, I'm going to try to punch through this wall, and I roll one die. okay, sure, I'm playing for 10. If I say, all right, as a superhero, I'm going to try to punch this wall, and I pick up 15 dice, I feel like a superhero.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Totally.
Speaking of that, there's actually a great example of that specific thing, really. Again, shout out to One Shot. They did a Shadowrun-based game called Flight of the Robins, where they created all of the Robins and Batgirls and Nightwing to be these player characters, and Batman's missing, and this James D'Amato wrote this really cool storyline that incorporated all of the Robins and Batgirls backgrounds into it and stuff. It's crazy, but it's literally an example of what Caleb just said, using Shadowrun as a mechanic to run a street level, not Superman game, but like a street level, Bat Family kind of game. I have a friend of mine, Christopher West from Maps and Mastery, who's literally working on a hack of the Fantasy Flight game Star Wars storytelling system to a superhero system, which sounds amazing to me. I've been watching some of the development of this, and I can't wait for that to come out, because the storytelling system for Fantasy Flight is so great with this balance of crunch and the narrative dice mechanic. I think would work beautifully for a superhero game if you get the mechanics right. I don't know if you could make like Superman, but you could certainly make some pretty cool powers, and they've already got like the ideas of the Force and some other things in there. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. And then honestly, D&D 5th edition, like you have podcasts like Total Party Thrill podcast. They've been recently doing a bunch of DC hero like ports into what would they look like in D&D. Sean Ellsworth from Tribality, he's done a bunch of the Avengers characters in D&D 5e for their version. So I mean, you could certainly use superheroes to inspire your characters in that system, but you could also kind of you're really just tweaking the flavor a little bit of where you're telling the story and literally run it. Of course, God's Fall. I mean, Aram Vardian, he says that that's basically swords and superheroes, so I think D&D 5th edition can be used to a certain extent to, duplicate some of these things. You just have to reflavor, a lot of what you're doing. But there's definitely something to be said about, okay, this is the system we're familiar with, so we'll go ahead and run a superhero game with that system. But there's also something to be said about systems like Masks or Prowlers and Paragons that are flexible, but also system light that you can really dive into. Prowlers and Paragons is a great game created and now in a new edition they're working on right now by people who have worked on Champions, that takes kind of all that advantage of being able to create everything you want. But again, getting the resolution down to being, you can create whatever you want as a superhero, but then the story is really about the story. You have your powers, but it's focusing on that. So keep an eye out for Prowlers and Paragons, particularly the new edition. That's pretty great. So there's something to be said by either way. Like people are like, well, why do you play D&D? Some people answer inertia. I've been playing it for 40 years. Why do I need to play anything else? Yeah, I get it. But there's definitely some advantages of other systems, and being able to see how mechanics feed into the storytelling.
Yeah, and it also helps if you're an aspiring designer, whether it be for other people because you want to, you want people to pay you, or just because you want to design stuff for your own games. It helps so much to be able to look at another system and to know how other systems work. It just expands your mind. The same way if you were an author, you'd want to read a lot of books, right? If you were going to be a movie producer, you'd want to watch a lot of movies. If you want to design stuff for role-playing games, you should read a lot of role-playing game rule sets. So yeah, I totally agree. It's funny, when you brought up the Star Wars dice, Rich, it made me think of, there's a sort of simpler system that a couple of guys put out called Story Cube, that uses these story cubes that you're supposed to roll with kids that have pictures on them, and then you use the pictures to improvise a story.
Yeah, it's Rory story cubes.
Yeah, Rory story cubes. So it uses those, and then it's a generic system that you can tell all kinds of great stories in, and they have a bunch of adventures ready to go. But you could also use that to tell a superhero story, which is pretty great.
You can. Speaking of games with kids, though, there's another one that was created that was kind of aimed at kind of education stuff. It's called Bash.
Oh,
and it was particularly and specifically designed for kids, but also to kind of incorporate education. And I think people who have heard me on podcasts before know I'm big on the gamification of education. It's pretty quick. It's not as kind of like crazy robust as like say Mutants and Masterminds or Champions or something like that. The crunch is kind of maybe like on a medium level, but it's really great introduction for kids. And there are other kids-related games that are kind of like that too, like Hero Kids and that kind of stuff, where they can feel like a superhero, but it's really set in a fantasy or science fiction game. I'd be shocked that Hero Kids doesn't have a superhero version at some point in time. I mean, really for me, it's getting kids into gaming and then being able to learn and teach and explore stories and emotional storylines and learning how to be empathic and work in a team, and all those things are really one of the things I love the most about tabletop gaming. So, and superheroes, what's the best way to get kids into gaming? Who doesn't want to be a superhero, right?
Yeah, kids are always playing superheroes, right? Power Rangers are superheroes. Yeah, it's so true.
Exactly. Yeah, good point.
Or Jedi. Jedi are superheroes. That's another thing.
They really are.
Why don't we end right now with a lightning round? So we've talked about how it depends really on what kind of game you want to play. So I'm going to throw out some sort of genres within superheroes, and then you guys tell me what system or systems you think you would use to play it. So it's just a lightning round, and it'll just be for people out there who are thinking about playing a superhero game. Give them some good places to look. So why don't we start with the tried and true dark and gritty? Where do people want to look if they want to play a dark and gritty superhero game?
I'll kick this one off. I'll say City of Mist is real good for that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Good call.
Cold Steel Wardens is real good for that.
Yep.
I think Savage Worlds, if we took any kind of superhero hack of Savage Worlds, that'll be real good.
Yep, there is a Superpowers companion for Savage Worlds, actually.
What about you, Rich? Do you have any to add?
No, I think I don't run a lot of Grim and Gritty. My Grim and Gritty days were back in Dark Champions from the 80s and 90s. So I think Caleb's got the more current versions I think would be good.
Gotcha. So how about silly? Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Like real over the top, everybody's just laughing the whole time. Howard the Duck silly level.
I think Wushu probably fits into that pretty well, don't you think, Caleb?
Yeah, Wushu would definitely let you do that. I think you could accomplish that with Fate if you've got a good social contract of everybody at the table to participate. Marvel Heroics, I think, would do that in the right game with the right players. I even think I'll throw that over to Open Legend RPG, which is not a specific superhero game, but it lets you build and define anything you want. The core of that mechanic is all the dice explode all the time. So it's really easy to get like a 40+ check on something. That feels to me like it could be super silly with the right players.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Gamma World too. I think you guys have
Oh
mentioned
yeah.
that.
Oh yeah, Gamma World. Gamma World can be this great balance of like super like depressed. It's basically like Adventure Time, the fantasy game, like if it leaned more toward the Mad Max and a little less toward the, bubblegum.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Adventure Time meets Mad Max. Holy.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
All right, so how about a game that is fun, like we're having fun, but it's grounded in reality, thinking, along the lines of like the first Iron Man movie, that sort of thing.
I would toss out Prowlers and Paragons for sure as one of those games. I would also, Masks might probably fit into that as well, because it's a little bit more about the story and the characters' lives and kind of how they relate to each other, and the mechanics focus on things like how what you do helps or hinders the team, and how failure moves you forward, which is always, what I think is more representative of real life than I succeeded, so I get better. It's more like, I failed, so I learned something, and then I got better.
I would throw out D&D 5e with a superhero hack, because I feel that 5e is a much more... We are trying to survive against the world around us type of game with a very slow development progression. So I think that evokes that sense of, okay, we're just learning how to be heroes because we haven't gotten our powers yet, or we don't know how to use them yet. 5e for me is a much more underpowered, low level type of game. So I think that fits.
Yeah. I think I need to give a shout out to a game. You were talking about a game that's kind of superheroes, but maybe not. The old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game.
That came across in my research. That was listed and was one of the greatest superhero role-playing games of all time by a couple lists. Yeah.
I loved that game. It's an emotional memory of that game, so I can't tell you exactly why I remember that game. I remember we had a freaking ton of fun with that game. And like with the comic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, not the TV show, the comic was much grittier and much more street level rough than the kind of light pizza eating TV show, though I bet you could probably, replicate that kind of thing as well. But if you can find that in PDF somewhere. Also, Villains and Vigilantes has gotten a reboot as well. It was a classic back in the day. Jeff D, who's a classic artist from back in the D&D days, they've rebooted that game. And, games like that and Prowlers and Paragons and Champions and that kind of thing can all be used to represent all the things you're asking about. It's just less in the system and more in how you want to run it.
And how about for crunchy games? Somebody, if you have a group that loves tinkering with the mechanics, what do you think is one of the best?
Absolutely, Champions. I like Mutants and Masterminds quite a bit. I have a lot of respect for Steve Kenson, and it's a solid game. Particularly the later editions are good. But man, I grew up on Champions, so I can't have any conversation like this without giving a shout out to Champions, particularly like 4th edition Champions, which is the big heavy hardback blue book with Dr. Destroyer on the cover. That was probably one of the best versions of the game in my opinion. Amazing stuff, actually. And then classic, the DC Heroes and the Marvel Hero game, they had a little bit of crunch to them, but really there's definitely the appeal of, like Caleb was saying, playing Batman, playing Wolverine, playing Green Lantern, playing Wonder Woman, Black Canary, having these characters that you're familiar with can be pretty fun too.
I'll say for crunch, let's go back to D&D 3.5 or Pathfinder. Those are world simulation games, so they are some of the crunchiest and deepest you can dig into there. I'll also say 4th edition D&D. If you hack that over to superheroes, that lets you get really crunchy with tactical combat. Everything in that game is a tactical combat simulator. So it lets you excel at the big battle scene and then role play out the side stuff afterwards. So I would definitely look at those two. If we want to hack out or just use as it is Exalted, that is one of the crunchiest systems I've ever looked at. So
that's a big book.
There's a lot out there.
That's a knock someone unconscious with book for sure. It's pretty big.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. It is just the PDF is $30, I think, which gives you an idea of how enormous.
God, so big.
Yeah. And a rules light superhero game.
Fate always falls into that, but you can do anything with Fate. But if you're looking for superhero specific, I'm not sure exactly if I would call Masks rules light. It's not crunchy, but it's definitely a different way of looking at games because it's about how you interact more than, crunching the numbers and rolling the dice and that kind of thing. I can't give enough shout outs to Masks just because I think it really takes a different look at superhero interactions.
Anything that is using the Powered by Apocalypse system.
That's a good call.
I would not call that rules light in the common understanding of that terminology, but it does change the focus to telling the story and figuring out why you roll the dice, not just because I want to do something, but because my narration told me to do it or motivated me to do it. But I'm going to end this like I started it. Wushu. Wushu is super simple. I think that is the epitome of rules light. And it is, in my opinion, the best way to throw down with a big silly superhero game, a more serious superhero game, anything. It really lets you do anything.
Nice. And then finally, is there a game on the horizon that has not come out yet that you would consider a superhero game that you are looking forward to? And I'll give you guys a moment to collect your thoughts. Back when I was on the Tome Show, we had a guy come on and talk about Strange Arcana. And that was superheroes take on the Elder Gods story, and I know they're planning on making that into a game world. I think they're going to use Savage Worlds for it, and it is just some of the art from it is fantastic. I'll see if I can link to all of that so that the viewers can check it out. But man, it is super super fun in the idea, and you see like these big flying spandex heroes taking on Cthulhu and stuff, which is super fun and very gonzo. So, how about you guys? Is there something you're looking forward to?
Yeah, for me, it's the Prowlers and Paragons Ultimate Edition, the Prowlers and Paragons UE. They've got Ross Watson and Sean Patrick Fannin, who worked on the newest re-release of Aaron Alston's Strike Force, working on that with the original designers of Prowlers and Paragons. I'm really looking forward to that. I've been keeping an eye on that development. I'm not sure when that comes out, sometime hopefully this year. But speaking of that too, if we're talking about a superhero thing, superheroes in general, I really need to suggest people go out and pick up either the original on PDF of Aaron Alston's Strike Force or the newest rebooted modern version of Aaron Alston's Strike Force. That book literally changed how I run games for my whole life. It came out in the late 80s. We didn't have blogs. We didn't have websites. This was basically a behind-the-scenes look at what worked and what didn't work in Aaron Alston's decades-long Champions world. It was mind-blowing. So you really, really, if you're going to go pick up anything in the next week, that should be the book you pick up. If you do pick up the new version, you also see I was honored to have a little nod, been able to write a little thank you to Aaron Alston. Of course, he passed away a few years ago at a con, which is unfortunate. So I have a little nod in there. You can see me read my or write my story of experience with the book, but it's fantastic. So the guys who worked on that new version are working on Prowlers and Paragons, so I'm really looking forward to that.
And I will say that there is a new game that will be hitting Kickstarter in February. It is called Axon Punk. A good friend of mine, Colin Kyle, is developing it. Mm-hmm. It is a more gritty cyberpunk game. It is made in the vein of the William Gibson style cyberpunk, not the wizards and magic plus technology cyberpunk that is Shadowrun. So it's much more a gritty street level technology and cyber driven game. But like we said earlier, I think that is a great system to explore heroics and being a superhero or being a street level do-gooder. There's a lot of elements of what is morality and opportunities to role play, that kind of thing. So that is what I'm looking forward to. And that is going to be, I believe, sometime in February, the 15th around, he's going to launch that.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. You guys are a wealth of knowledge, and I could listen to you talk forever. And I would love to have you back on for us to define what makes a superhero game at some point, because I feel like that is a question that could have many answers, and we could just talk a whole episode about probably.
I am all about that. Let's do it.
Yep. Sounds good to me.
Excellent. But if people do want to hear more of you, read more of your writings, you guys mentioned some places at the beginning of the podcast. Remind people where those are that they can find you. Why don't we start with you, Caleb?
The best place to find me is on Twitter. I am at @TheCalebG. A lot of my writing about tabletop gaming is over on therpgacademy.com. And of course, the current show we are talking about, Whelmed, is found at crashingthemode.com. And, you know, one of these days we're going to get some articles up there where we talk about what it is to be a superhero and
one
that
of these
kind
days.
of thing. One of these days when we're not so busy recording and editing.
And what about you, Rich? Where can people find you?
Well, you can find my historical documentation on tribality.com. My columns there for mostly D&D 5e. And you can also find my personal website is richhowardauthor.com. You can also get there via gameschangelives.com. I'm going to start I took a break from that to do a lot of writing for Tribality. I'm probably going to get back to my home website quite a bit now. Tribality is a great website, by the way. You should go check that out. And then, of course, You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files. You can also find us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/crashingthemode. It's MODE. If you've seen the show, you get what that means. And that's it. So most of my effort and energy right now is being put into Whelmed and trying to expand that out as much as possible and show my love of storytelling, of comics characters, and what we can learn from really, really well-written shows for our own stuff.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble today. I hope you are as thoroughly whelmed as I am.
Thoroughly whelmed. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Thanks, guys. Wow, that was a great interview. Huge thanks to Rich and Caleb. And remember to check out the Whelmed podcast. Tabletop Babble is still a super new show, listeners, and the best way to help it grow and to help others find it is to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever you're listening to us with. To encourage you to leave us a great review, I'm reading out one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and crediting the person who left it. Make me say anything you want. Make it fun for me, people. Today's 5-star review comes from Serious Harms. It is a review entitled James Introcaso is a modern-day Morley Safer. It reads, James is the top RPG industry journalist and has a vast network of contacts with the industry insiders. All Tabletop Babble needs is its own Andy Rooney to ask the really tough RPG questions. Thank you so much, Serious Harms. It is great to have you listening. People, come make me say anything you want, and next week we got a doozy. And if you want to support the show financially, there's an easy way to do it that doesn't cost you anything extra. Before you shop on Amazon or DriveThruRPG, go to our website, don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, and click on the banners on the left. Heck, bookmark the links that they take you to make it easy on yourself. Then just shop as you normally would. Costs you nothing extra and throws a few pennies on the dollar our way. Okay, people, you can find out everything I do at Twitter at James Introcaso, that's at JamesIntrocaso, and on my website, worldbuilderblog.me. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Special thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Until next time, remember that RPGs are like sex. If everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.